Hi Rick, I would like to welcome you as a very special guest to the series of teleseminars. It's a real pleasure to have a little time with you again. We don't get much of it recently. And this will be a very special bonus for our listeners.
Happy to do it.
So I have been presenting this series of 7 seminars in which I'm trying to cover all the major observations and experiences from like 60 years of consciousness research. And I realized that there's, in all those seminars, a very important dimension that's missing, which is archetypal astrology of all things, something that has been very important for you and me the last 30 years. And it's really something extremely significant. So I'm very glad that you're here to fill in at least sort of partially that.
Do some headlines. Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
So I just put it a little in the clinical context. Since the time I started working with psychedelics, our major concern was to find some ways of predicting what experiences people would have and whether or not they would benefit from these sessions. And we tried all the tests that are available in Western psychology, Rorschach, MMPI, TAT, you name it. And they were basically useless for a variety of reasons, one of them being that if you do retesting, they don't change very much. Mm-hmm. If you do tests today and 30 days from now, it's going to be just about the same. Whereas if people take psychedelic today and take it 30 days from now, it could be completely different. And so it doesn't even have the versatility that is necessary, for covering the incredible richness of this. And so when we found out something that was really powerfully predictive, it just happened to be more controversial than psychedelics themselves. There was something, astrology, something that you call the gold standard of gullibility and ignorance.
Right. It's the gold standard of superstition in our culture. It's the astrology is what you would compare something to if you really wanted to emphasize that it was completely unworthy of serious intellectual concern.
Really like a Cinderella.
Yeah.
So it was quite amazing to find the incredible specificity which astrology can, particularly transit astrology, can predict what people would experience in these states. It was not concretely, but archetypic.
Right.
I think you probably say something about that.
Sure.
So I see today, after this over 30 years of our cooperation, astrology to be something like Rosetta Stone. And I believe that if psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy go in the right direction, that it will be in the future the work with non-ordinary states, especially the category that I call holotropic states, and using archetypal astrology as a guidebook.
Yeah, as a kind of template for both the character and the timing of people's experiences. Yeah.
So people probably would be interested how the two of us with academic training, how we got into using astrology.
Yeah, because it really was one of the last possible avenues of exploration that we considered, even though we were living in a place, Esalen Institute in Big Sur, where so many perspectives, ancient and shamanic and modern and scientific, Asian, mystical, etc. So many different perspectives were being offered there, and astrology was certainly in the mix. It was part of the vocabulary and the kind of general worldview of the let's call it the counterculture of that period, and as it still is. But we still hadn't, I think, glimpsed just how powerful a tool and perspective that it was going to provide for the work that was of most interest to us. Well, the background for me is I'd done my undergraduate studies right in the kind of epicenter of the psychedelic revolution, in the sense that it was at Harvard, and so the influence of Leary and Alpert's work and Ralph Metzner as well was very much part of the milieu there in the late 60s and early 70s when I went to college there. And I studied, I was studying depth psychology, Freud, Jung, and also the Ram Dass actually had just come back from India and had changed his name, and that's when I met him there in at a house of a friend there in Cambridge, right when he came back from India. So after I graduated, I was especially compelled by the possibility that psychedelics could be of value in a therapeutic context, also for the exploration of the nature of things, of the cosmos, of our deepest inner reality. The therapeutic or transformative effect was certainly of interest, but it was also this kind of potential telescope into the nature or microscope into the nature of the deeper reality of things. It was also compelling. So I heard about your work and wrote you, it was actually something that Abraham Maslow had written that made me think that whatever you were doing was of great value. And I wrote you thinking that you were still in Maryland, and the letter came back from Esalen, which I'd already had been thinking about maybe doing a little study there as part of my graduate work. So you said, come and visit if you're in the area. So I did, and then ended up living and working at Esalen for 10 long, extraordinary years. And during all those years, you were there as well as the scholar in residence. So it was a great laboratory for our work there. And while we were there, after I think we'd been working together for about a year, I was working on my dissertation, and then someone came through to one of your month-long workshops here, and
Arne Trettevik. Yeah.
Arne Trettevik, and he was a person who really knew his astrology, and he particularly was someone who followed the transits and transit astrology, which is where the planets are at any given time as they keep moving relative to where they were when you were born.
I remember him walking around with the ephemeris and everything.
Yes.
That something was happening, he was always checking.
Yeah, he was, I think, so compelled by the correlations that he was always tracking them. And having then, once we were kind of initiated into the study, we could kind of see why he was so compelled by it. I should mention one background point, and that is that I had a glimpse that astrology might be of relevance because of Jung's work with astrology, and he had used it so much. And a Jungian professor, he was also a therapist, but he was a professor at Harvard Divinity School, who I knew, had started to tell me a little bit about astrology and my birth chart while I was in Cambridge, but I brushed it off. I thought, this is much lower level of discussion than we could be having. But now with this new prompt, we decided, I opened up to it. And you actually helped me be more open to it just in theory by, as we started to see the correlations, you said, well, in your understanding, it wasn't so much that the planets were kind of physically, mechanistically causing things to happen. In your understanding, it was more like, as it were, built into the kind of whole structure of things, of the cosmos and of the human psyche, and so it wasn't something that we needed to understand in a kind of Newtonian or even Einsteinian way, but rather more of the idea that, as Plotinus says, everything breathes together.
I had glimpses from my psychedelic sessions that there is like a sort of archetype, a Platonic kind of a dimension, and that really forms and informs what's happening here, and that the whole thing is part of a large picture, actually, the movements of the planets, you know, and the angular relationships are somehow part of the big picture.
Yeah.
And the realization that you would really have to change radically your understanding, that you cannot add it just to the current
Right.
worldview.
Yeah, and one of the key things that it requires is an openness to the possibility that a capacity that meanings and spiritual and moral and aesthetic qualities and values can be intrinsic to the cosmos, outside of the human as well as interior to the human, that it's not just a human construct. That just opens up the possibility that we are embedded in a larger field of meanings and purposes, rather than we are the exclusive creators or constructors of meanings.
But before we continue, I wanted to mention a couple of things. One, I'm still astonished by the incredible synchronicity when you came and wanted to work with me on your dissertation about LSD psychotherapy, and you were looking for a place at Esalen. So it's a big place and a lot of cabins and so on.
Yeah.
The only place available in all of Esalen was the studio, which was in the same house where we were, a floor lower. And to me, it seems like a sort of a almost karmic setup of some sort.
Yeah, it was a great.
And the other one, you were also kind of being sort of prepared for it by being a night guard. You were fascinated by the stars there, sitting like, most of the nights and just watching the grandiosity of the universe.
Yes.
And the stars are so amazing in Big Sur.
Yes, yeah. No, that was I almost felt like certainly there was that kind of beautiful synchronistic.
The scene was being prepared.
Yeah. And after living most of my life in urban settings, to suddenly have hour after hour at night, being able to sit on the cliff and watch the stars and the Milky Way and the moon and the planets move across the heavens was like it was a kind of numinous experience that I almost felt later that I was so compelled by it, I almost felt like there was a sort of transmission, nothing explicit, but more of a feeling that I was being brought into a sense of a numinously charged or informed cosmos. It's not just an inner journey; it's also a journey of reconnection with the whole.
Yeah, and I sort of created independently also two concepts that were particularly useful bridges to astrology. One was the concept of perinatal matrices, seeing people actually living birth and then linking their experiences to the 4 consecutive stages of birth. And I described the phenomenology, the type of emotions that people have, the type of physical feeling, the kind of symbolism coming from the transpersonal level that's associated with it, without knowing anything about astrology. Right. And then the other one, I also noticed that the elements in the unconscious are not sort of organized as a kind of a unconnected mosaic, you see, of independent elements, but that they form certain dynamic constellations, layer constellations, which I call systems of condensed experience, or COEX systems. Let's say you might have a choking COEX system, where would be near drowning experience when you were 7, a series of situations of being strangled by your older brother when you were 4 to 5, then maybe whooping cough, and then choking in the birth canal and then some kind of a past life experience.
Yes, yeah.
So this was very important, describing the dynamics of the psychedelic sessions. And
Yeah.
that's.
I think that's one of your most, or both, those are two of your most brilliant findings and theoretical formulations, the perinatal matrices and the coax systems, because in many ways it opens up a synthesis of Freud and Jung, of the more biological, instinctual focus of psychoanalysis with the more archetypal, spiritual focus of the Jungian psychology. But it also, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it was really the perinatal matrices that linked in a meaningful way Freud and Jung
Yeah.
by this perinatal level that neither of them really believed in.
Right. Yeah. Ironically, yes.
And around who brought that concept had a little different understanding than the four perinatal matrices and
Right.
focusing on the passage and the struggle
Yeah.
in the birth canal.
Yeah. Well, it was actually the work that you had done, particularly recognizing the kind of coherent class of experiences of many different kinds that all fit within the phenomenology of the intrauterine first perinatal matrix, or the struggle in the birth canal, or the actual experience of birth, and how the breakthrough of sudden liberation from oppression in a political context could be experienced intermixed with experiences of the moment of biological birth, or of the experience of suddenly breaking out of an old paradigm into a new sense of the cosmos and so forth. And it was just so helpful just on its own terms. But then when we both were taught how to, we learned how to calculate birth charts and how to calculate the transits, and were given some textbooks for what the meanings were of the different transits. And so, because we both had pretty good records of our memories of our own LSD sessions, we could track what was happening, where the planets were at the time of the different sessions, and to just see both the consistency and the precision of meaning with which the correlations started just revealing themselves. That it was just astonishing, and it just kept deepening. I mean, at first I got a sense for how there were certain transits that seemed to coincide with more difficult sessions, and other transits that other kinds of transits, classes of them, that tended to coincide with breakthroughs and ecstatic sessions. But then it was especially astonishing was to discover that each of the outer planet transits, which moved more slowly across the birth chart, had a coherent connection to each one of the four perinatal matrices.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah.
It just, there's just no reason why these different, categories which you had teased out of hundreds, thousands of LSD sessions and seen the patterns and then formulated them, that any astrologer who knows the meanings of the planets that have been empirically observed thousands of times by astrologers, and there's universal consensus among practicing astrologers about the meanings of transits of Neptune or Saturn and so forth. They would, to see how perfectly those correlated with the meanings that you had discovered in the inner world of the psychedelic sessions, was just a revelation. But I should leap to say that it was very important to us that we noticed that it wasn't something that had a kind of rigid, concrete, deterministic, predictive quality. It seems that astrology provided a means by which, you remember you were looking at using all these different psychological tests like the MMPI or the Rorschach that proved of no value with LSD sessions. And the reason astrology seemed to provide this value is that it was archetypally predictive rather than concretely predictive. In other words, it could tell us that during this period of time, this person with this particular natal chart would be more likely to have experiences that would coincide, experiences that would be have sudden breakthroughs of certain kinds, or would it could be exciting, liberating, opening, but we didn't know for sure whether it would necessarily be a breakthrough on the perinatal level, or it could be more something of the biographical level, like.
Or something even happened in their actual life. Right?
Exactly, right, exactly. Like they suddenly break out of a confining job situation, or something that had been limiting their mind in some way, and in their work, and they suddenly get a breakthrough. So we can see the general quality of experience, but as to which dimension of being, interpersonal or mystical or psychological, intellectual, that's not determined. And in addition, we were also noticing that there, not only is it multidimensional, but it's also multivalent. In other words, for example, like this Saturn, relating to the Saturn archetype, the Senex in the depth psychology, has so much it can relate to experiences of confinement, of constriction, but also of connections with the past, or with tradition, or with a sense of grounding, or capacity for deep, sustained labor on behalf of a purpose that is perhaps a noble purpose, and so forth. And so the range of ways in which an archetype can manifest, yet still be true to its essence.
Nature,
it was that was crucial. So there was always this this sense that we had it was more like finding out which way the winds were going to be blowing on a particular day before we go out sailing or surfing. It was very valuable information, but it didn't necessarily determine everything about that day. So that autonomy that it's left the human being within the field was an important part of the.
Yeah, I'd like to go back, to the earlier history where we got to the point where we were both fascinated by astrology, but we kind of did like a division of labor. I mean, you became like a full-time astrologer. I still continued, working with non-ordinary states, so I was more like the person who was bringing the interesting material from psychedelic sessions, spiritual emergencies, breakthroughs, psychotic, episodes and so on. And you were a full-time sort of astrologer, and actually you shifted at a certain point from the full focus on the individual transformation to the historical sources,
the collective.
And I think this was incredible. I mean, we spent 30 years studying the collective transits, and I think there you got, by studying what was happening in those periods, but also studying the representatives, historical representatives, you got just a knowledge of the nuances and the multivalence that I don't think anybody has, that the contribution to astrology as much as psychology.
I think, yeah, it definitely helped. Though I also have to say, the extraordinary opportunity of working with you there at Esalen all those years allowed, people were lining up after I finished my dissertation, which I did at the guard shack there at Esalen, and I had started to get the astrological understanding. People were just like lining up at the guard shack to get their transits read, and so because so many people came to Esalen specifically for deep transformative experiences, it was a morphic field that just kind of encouraged that kind of self-exploration and also tended to catalyze experiences. So we just had a fantastic laboratory for, not only with the psychedelic research, but with people who were doing Gestalt therapy or who were having powerful experiences doing Neo-Reichian intensives and so forth, or just spontaneous things that tended to happen. So that combined with the richness of our own psychedelic sessions, I think really opened up my sense of the nuances and the multivalences of how it works.
And then there's this amazing thing happened that CIS allowed us to offer classes,
They encouraged more than allowed. It was amazing.
Two controversial areas that work with non-ordinary states and archetypal astrology. And today you have incredible following among the students. I've been watching how they are now adding different dimensions. Now there's a whole group, people watching what's happening in the world and discussing.
Large research.
So it's a collective work now, adding sort of new dimensions really, including Becca, your daughter, becomes very accomplished.
She really is.
Yeah.
That was after we moved up to the Bay Area after all our years there in Big Sur, and by that point I'd written the book Passion of the Western Mind as a kind of bridge from the farther out research we've been doing to more of a history of Western thought that could introduce the notion of archetypes, for example, as it evolved from Plato and Aristotle to Jung and your work, but also to give a sense for the paradigm shifts in our understanding of the cosmos. I had studied in the course that Thomas Kuhn had started at Harvard on the Copernican revolution. It had a big influence on me when I was 18, 19, taking in that work. And so the study of the evolution of our cosmology, along with our evolution of philosophy and the importance of the archetypal perspective, etc., I decided to put that into a book. It was going to be just the first few chapters of Cosmos and Psyche, but then, it had a life of its own, these books, and I decided to publish that, just the history of Western thought there, and surprisingly it got introduced into the academic world, and so that now hundreds of universities have been using it as a text, and that's why when we came up to the Bay Area, and CIS asked if I would teach there. I thought I would just be teaching the philosophy and the history of Western thought, but there was not only the students, but the administration. I think particularly we can thank Robert McDermott, who was president. Very encouraging, and wanting it to happen. Yeah, and those were have been amongst the most popular courses there for the last 20 plus years.
And then of course Esalen was very receptive. We did some Esalen workshops and took it even to Europe and Switzerland.
Well, Esalen was key.
To the World Congress of Astrology.
Yes, that's right, in Switzerland.
Anyway, I would like to just bring up a few issues that I hear when we're using astrology in the training, and the kind of questions that come up. One of them is, of course, Jung. Was again pioneer in this, as he was in many other areas. and astrology was one of the things that the areas that he became very interested in. And in his essay, Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle, he used astrology as a major example.
Mm-hmm.
So people usually ask the question of causality, what is causal and causal, and they usually think about causality in a very narrow sense, and I know that you and I see it somewhat broader,
Right.
more in Aristotelian.
Yeah, I think the reason that Jung described synchronicity as acausal is because he was countering the tendency in modern thought to think of causality as only being linear, mechanistic causality, like a Newtonian billiard ball hitting another billiard ball. And that's, Aristotle would call that's like efficient causation. And also he would describe as the material cause as being a factor there too. But he, with his, I think he had a more comprehensive and subtle understanding of causality than the modern, where he also said that formal and final causation is also important to bring into our understanding. They are necessary conditions for the emergence of a phenomenon. And so the formal cause would be, well, if we were to have like a vase, for example, the material cause would be the clay itself. The efficient cause would be the potter who created it. But the formal cause would be the form, the shape, in that sense, the kind of archetypal patterning of
the idea that the archetypal world sort of forms and informs
exactly
what's happening.
Yeah,
And I guess the final cause
yeah,
would probably manifest most in actually the experiences of birth and death, wouldn't it? When it sort of connects us to the larger.
well,
cosmos.
I think also
When would you see the final?
in synchronicities as well as in astrology, which as Jung suggested could be seen as a form of synchronicity on a grand cosmic scale, basically. For Jung, synchronicities not only were archetypally patterned, they also were serving a purpose. They were moving the psyche towards wholeness. Mm-hmm. And so, in some sense, the self archetype with capital S was constellating the synchronicities, the matching of inner and outer meanings to help break us out of our unconsciousness, of the dissociation between our conscious and unconscious psyche, but also between ourselves as human subjects and the world as an object, and it moves us towards wholeness in that way too. And that seems to be a big part of synchronicity, is to kind of wake us up to the fact that we're not the only game in town in terms of having capacity for meanings, that somehow meaning can be carried by the movements of the birds landing on the roof of a person right at the time that something significant is happening. All the things that Jung would point out, the golden scarab insect coming in the window at the same moment that the patient is describing a dream about a golden scarab being given to her, etc. So in all these ways, there seems to be a kind of purpose as well as a form, and in that sense, you could say that archetypal, I would say astrology has an archetypally causal quality to it, but it's not that I don't believe that the planets are physically in a kind of like a gravitational or electromagnetic radiation kind of causal framework. It's more like they are. The clock. We use the clock metaphor.
That's another thing that people usually ask. the major misconception that we talk about some radiation or some gravitational field.
Right.
I had actually that discussion with Carl Sagan, who was absolutely livid when he heard about
Your interest in astrology, right?
Yeah, and he said, astrology is total hogwash. He said, as I'm standing here, I have more influence on you than Pluto. And he was brilliant, he thought, in terms of me, my mass of my body, mass of his body, the distance between us, distance between me and Pluto.
Yeah.
And of course, that kind of influence would be negligible of
Right.
Pluto.
Right.
But if he understood really something about astrology, kind of elements that are associated with Pluto, like volcanic eruptions and tidal waves and
Or deep
earthquakes
Kundalini arousal,
or
yeah.
nuclear physics and
Yeah, it's a whole. Well, that's an example of the lack of a capacity for a certain kind of symbolic cognition. It's a literal mindset. It tends to look at matter in a kind of opaque way rather than to recognize be able to see symbolically, or what James Hillman calls having an archetypal eye, being able to recognize the archetypal patterning. So yeah, it's a stumbling block, and truth be told, I think astrology requires something of a kind of opening of the heart as well as the mind. It's a kind of the I think Will Keepan calls them the epistemologies of the heart, where you have to draw on intuitive, empathic, symbolic forms of cognition beyond just the more narrow forms of sensory rational assessment.
But that whole confusion, the linear causality with the synchronicity, and both you and I in the classes give the example of the watch.
Yeah.
That there's a time that we cannot perceive directly. So we have all kinds of gadgets that are synchronized with time, that show us what time it is. So if I look at my watch and it says 7 o'clock, I reasonably expect that it's going to be on the watches people in the same time zone who show correct time.
Yeah.
And that it be on the clock towers. And then, I could expect to get 7 o'clock news when I turn on my television. And when I called the restaurant and said I would like a table for 7 o'clock, I can reasonably expect that when I walk into that restaurant when it's showing 7,
Yeah.
that they will have a seat for me. So none of those things cause any other, but they are systematically correlated, with
Right.
a dimension that we cannot directly perceive. So what's happening with the stars, where they are, what kind of angular relationships they form, shows us really what's happening in the world of archetypes and what kind of energies we would expect here,
Yeah.
and then specifically in connection to our chart, which would be our personal transits. So
Yes.
it's a totally different way
Yeah.
of thinking about things that we usually have. And there's another thing that's very, very difficult for people to see, that in astrology, time is not just quantitative, it's qualitative.
Right.
I mean, each moment is it's saturated with meaning. I think
Yeah.
you gave the example
Yeah.
of wine.
Yeah.
From
a certain
wine
year.
from different
Yeah.
years.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more than that. I mean, it's archetypally loaded. I mean, at each moment. And,
Yeah.
So when you are born at that moment, I mean, it's going to have tremendous implications and consequences for your life.
Yeah, it's like an archetypal field that is saturating the zeitgeist, and then each of us is born as a kind of inflection, individual inflection of it, and then as we live our lives and the planets keep moving, it seems to correlate with the continuing unfolding of the potentialities in the birth chart into actuality, and according to what kind of agency we bring into it too. It's not all pre-given. It seems more like we're asked to be more the more consciousness and intelligence and courage and compassion and so forth that we can bring to the put in musical terms, the chordal structure that we're given. It's up to us what music we make, what dance we dance. The melodies that we bring to these particular chordal structures are up to us. But there does seem to be a certain underlying archetypal field that is unique to each of us, and then at the same time is in a constant process of unfolding in new ways.
I have several more things that might be interesting to touch upon. One would be, people usually say, does it mean that my life is completely deterministic, that I'm this pawn, sort of, and does it make me a slave of
right. Yeah,
astrology?
As a kind of puppet.
So
a puppet.
it would be interesting to address that.
See, I think there is astrology was originated in much earlier eras when I think there was much more of a sense that the celestial gods were determining what was happening on this plane, in the same way that the pharaoh at the top of the pyramid was determining what was going on in the rest of the society. And but as part of the nature of contemporary astrology is that it has, to a great extent, integrated the breakthroughs of Jung in particular, of depth psychology, and particularly Jung, who recognized the value of astrology as well. In fact, he seems to have been using it with he said he was using it with all his patients in the latter part of his life. That he saw it as just invaluable for understanding what's going on at a deeper level in their psyche. So, as a result of this kind of psychological revolution that astrology's incorporated, there's much more recognition of how, first of all, being conscious of what archetypal forces are active in each person, some predispositions, but also range of potentialities within each person and each archetypal configuration in their charts and lives. But that ability to, in some way, be able to recognize which forces are activated at which time and in what combinations actually gives us more autonomy than less. It gives a greater capacity for reflection, for conscious direction of how we interact with it. And in that sense, it's really a continuation of the depth psychology project, which is to make the unconscious more conscious.
Finding how much we are determined by our unconscious actually gives a certain degree of freedom.
Yeah, it liberates us from our unconsciousness.
And I know that you actually do something like a kind of astrological consultation, telling people what they can bring into their life to honor the archetypes, rather than being sort of victims of them, and use it for something that ultimately becomes positive in their life.
Yeah, I mean the gods
talk about
want to be heard.
Saturn, Neptune, or the people to go into some kind of sesshin or some meditation retreat, which would mean the rigor and coercion that comes with Saturn, but give it in the service of spirituality and actually get something out of it. That would manifest in much less favorable ways in your life. Or I remember you telling this, how you found that the people, the SLN crew, they all had Saturn, Mars.
The maintenance crew
This would be the time to build something if you have Saturn,
Mars. Yeah, where you've got that kind of yang physical energy of wanting to, Mars wants to be forcefully energetic, and Saturn wants to create things that are solid and constructed, and it's just remarkable that all the people that worked in the maintenance department at Esalen during the whole decade that I was there, all had Mars and Saturn in major aspect. It was almost like a hidden thing that they had to have in their CV, though I know it wasn't actually sought out. Well, a couple things I thought I would mention before we call an end to this is, one is with respect to the coexes and that particular conceptual breakthrough that you had in understanding how each of us has certain dynamic constellations of memories and experiences that are all related. They have a common theme to them of emotional, somatic, spiritual, philosophical dimensions, and so forth. But they are layered according to the different parts of times in one's life when the powerful imprinting experiences are traumatic, or they could be a positive coex as well. And what we found was that the primary coex systems in a person's life were understandable, deeply connected in a meaningful way to particular configurations in the birth chart. And what was more remarkable is that when transits would happen to those planetary configurations later in life, that's when the coex system would get reactivated. Another layer would come in.
And actually, when that activation happens, in many instances, it's also a good time to work on it.
Exactly.
Activate it and now use it for therapy, actually.
Exactly, which is one of those liberating potentials where, either that astrology brings in, either you can kind of unconsciously act out the same complex again, and then that creates even more of a problematic predisposition to draw towards you. We kind of create our reality through our assumptions about how people are going to be, etc. A hostile, aggressive person tends to live in a hostile, aggressive world that in part they have elicited by their behavior and their assumptions. Well, taking that insight into this dimension, we find that if we know our transits and we see, okay, here's when this part of my psyche is more likely to be activated, this could be a very good opportunity to like, let's say, get in touch with my aggression, or with the aspects deep in my psyche that I sometimes tune into, where I fall into a place of deep sorrow that I normally keep, kind of out of the way and, repressed, and I go about my life, but in a subtle way it may be affecting my life because it's always there. And then under this transit I can do inner work, like a holotropic breath work or LSD session or an ayahuasca journey, and be able to come in contact with that particular complex, get insights into the experiences that have framed it, that have shaped it, and then even relive things that are locked in my psyche and my body, and so it can actually be a very liberating opportunity rather than a one more activation of the traumatic field.
I cannot resist bringing, one major thing at the end, which is something that has relevance for the whole field of psychiatry and psychology, not just certain aspects of theory or practice. And that's when we introduced to our courses, Psyche and Cosmos, discussion of the different schools of psychotherapy. And I would talk about Freud and Jung and Adler and Fritz Perls and so on. And you would sort of show the charts.
Yes.
And we see that, and this includes me, you do my chart as well.
Sure.
That we all thought that we are creating psychology that's relevant for everybody at any time. And what you showed in these classes is that actually all the founders of these different schools, they were actually like channels or spokesmen for the major sort of archetypal combinations in their charts.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. So the realization that we really don't have any kind of terrain to study.
That's solid and fixed.
We see different patients at different times because they reflect what is happening with the transits, and then people bring their own sort of archetypal set that kind of creates like a lens that sort of tunes you specifically, put emphasis on a certain area you don't quite well see the others.
Kind of filter a selective stencil.
So, the whole discussion about diagnosis, we have DSM-5 now and constant fights about what belongs there, what doesn't, and psychiatrists complain that they cannot really match what they see in their clients and what's written in the book. This is just totally blown by this observation. That we would have to, the way we would have to approach it is to have tools that would help us to identify or diagnose any particular situation by looking at what are the world transits, what are the personal transits of the people we work with, and then put a certain correction on our own archetypal biases.
Which
maybe we attract certain kinds of patients and so on. So this takes care of this kind of idea of objectivity, of creating diagnose. Let's just make a joke out of DSM and all those kinds of tools.
That tendency towards a kind of universalization and objectification of the psyche, which is much more dynamically indeterminate and multivalent, and it can reveal itself in different ways at different times, different peoples, different eras.
So I think this combination of pessimistic, optimistic, I think it's a good ending of the discussion. So,
well, if I could let me just add to this. While it's true that that Freud's psychology is extraordinarily reflective in so many details, how we've done it, all the themes that he's compelled by, etc. It's so is reflected in his birth chart. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And then same thing with Jung. I mean, the studies now that are being done on how Jung's transits, as during the period he was writing the Red Book and was having this deep descent into the unconscious, really is, he had extraordinary transits there. But his birth chart is such a perfect metaphor, kind of visual metaphor, symbolic template for his own psychology and yours as well. And
I have all the matrices, the major.
The way and this points out the way in which these, like an archetypal complex that corresponds to a planetary configuration in the birth chart, it can act as a kind of door, or it can act as a kind of wall that walls us into a particular worldview, a particularly limited understanding, where we distort the wide range of phenomena that would otherwise be visible. But it's also, an archetypal complex can also serve as a window or a door to another reality. It can help us get insights into things that we didn't have before. So I think...
So it's not wrong, it's not distorted view, it's just a particular clarity and sensitivity to a certain band of the spectrum. Very much as if, you know, we have electromagnetic spectrum of different wavelengths, and it would be like having people who are particularly have particular disposition to study, you know, infrared or
Right.
you know.
But there is the danger of, as Freud demonstrates, of, you know, turning everything into the Oedipus complex, or everything is.
The problem is when you start interpret the other bands in terms of your own
Exactly.
bias, but
Yeah.
as long as you stay within your own focus, I mean, you can have some,
Yes.
you know, extraordinary insights.
Yeah. So I think you know, the last thing I'd like to share with your audience here for the virtual course is the fact that one of the gifts I think that archetypal astrology gives us today is the recognition that that human consciousness and each of us as individuals, as well as the earth itself, seem to be in some ways centers of cosmic meaning. It's like with the Copernican revolution, of course, the earth is moving and spinning, and the sun is as well, and that can either send us into a place of just feeling we're a meaning-seeking speck of dust in a meaningless cosmos that can create a lot of sense of alienation and disorientation, etc. And what the astrological evidence points to is the fact that we in fact seem to be situated within, embedded in a cosmos that is informed by profound and very complexly nuanced meanings and purposes and fields of them, but that they, in some way, the movements of the planets give us an indication that the Earth itself is a focus of cosmic meaning, and that each individual seems to be as well as each unfolding moment in our lives. So it creates a kind of healing in a way, moving out of that sense of the isolated, existentialist anti-hero who is locked into a no-exit cosmos that is absurd. And it's a kind of, in a way, it's a movement from the perinatal crisis of being locked, feeling alienated and meaningless, into a reconnection to a numinous whole that can be very healing.
You know, there's a similar kind of validation that comes from the work with holotropic states, because the mystics make statements that you usually consider absurd, like, I'm an insignificant part of the universe, but I'm also the whole universe.
Yeah.
So say, don't you know Aristotelian logic, you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
And I didn't have really, I knew it intuitively, but I didn't have a good answer until holography came.
Mm-hmm.
You see, if you are thinking in terms of something that you can weigh and measure, we are insignificant part. When I say I am the whole universe, I talk about information that becomes available to me. I can become anything that's part of existence. It is not always the.
Yeah.
So in that sense, sort of information,
Yeah.
informational aspect, and I can identify myself as anything, including the universe itself. So in that sense, I am the whole universe. It shouldn't be confused with, you know, the kind of Galilean restriction that you should be interested only what you can measure and what you can
Right.
weigh.
Quantitative.
So that shift from, you know, being an insignificant part of the universe, but center of the meaning, which comes from astrology, and this distinction that comes between, you know, me as I can be put on the way,
Yes.
on the scale, and,
Right.
Measured, and me, what my experiential potential is. This is tremendous validation. Sort of,
As Rumi says, not only is the drop in the ocean, the ocean is in the drop. In some sense, the entire ocean is present in the drop, and in some way, each of us is, the whole cosmos is kind of, in Whiteheadian terms, concressing into us, and through these means we can, that you're sharing now, we can open up to that much larger identity.
It's also expressed in the Avatamsaka or Hawaiian Buddhism, in mutual interpenetration. And there's a great story that illustrates it, where there was an empress who had difficulties understanding what they were talking about. So she called this sage to explain it to her, and he took her into this hall, which was all covered, the ceiling, the floor, and the walls, with mirrors. And he lit a candle, and suddenly there were millions of candles, all around. And this is, how the one is in many. And then he took out a crystal, and then all those fake lights of the candles were all collected into one. This is how the many are in one. But he said, but this is a very static model. You have to imagine it sort of all in these motions and interpenetration.
Which I imagine your
Great
students will,
image.
your students will have access to that experientially. What you just said.
So Rick, on this note, thank you so much again. It is such a great contribution to the seminar, and I'm sure our viewers will not only appreciate it, but I hope they get enough interest to pursue it on their own, because it's such a tool for any serious seeker.
My pleasure. I'm glad to
Thank you
have this
for
time.
your immense contributions to it.
It's complete. I'm completely in your debt, Stan.
Okay, thank
All
you
right.
again.